Welcome to another episode of Philosophy and Critical Thinking. In this episode, we are going to talk about Meditation 1 from René Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy. So, who was René Descartes? Descartes was a 17th century French mathematician and philosopher. He's often considered a foundational figure in what's known as the early modern period of philosophy, which begins basically around the same time as the scientific enlightenment and lasts for a couple centuries. Descartes was known for things other than philosophy. He invented a field called analytic geometry. He's responsible for various kinds of mathematical notation. He was writing during a time of great intellectual ferment. So during the scientific enlightenment, scientists had begun to use mathematical techniques to challenge very common sense assumptions, common sense beliefs. For example, scientists Galileo Galilei and Johannes Kepler used math and some precise observations to show that appearances to the contrary, the sun does not revolve around Earth. It's actually the other way around. Despite what common sense seems to tell us, the Earth is not at rest, but rather is more like a top spinning very quickly around its axis. Descartes was on the side of the scientists. He was trying to provide some reason to challenge common sense beliefs, to instill a more or less healthy distrust of our sensory beliefs. And so Descartes is most known in philosophy for his epistemology, or his theory of knowledge. And so let's talk about that. He announces at the very beginning of the Meditations that he's going to try to demolish all of his beliefs. This might seem like a very strange thing to do. Why would one try to demolish one's beliefs? What Descartes is after in this first meditation is a kind of solid justification for all of human knowledge. He's trying to lay down a foundation for knowledge. In Descartes' view, in order to do this, to provide a justification for knowledge, we have to use a kind of mathematical method. So think about how you proceed in mathematics to try and prove something. You start with some fundamental axioms. These are things that are supposed to be self-evident and irrefutable, but they themselves are not going to be proven. We're just going to assume that they're true in order to try to use them to prove other things. Then once we have some axioms on the table, we can use self-evident principles of deduction. Remember, a couple videos ago, we talked about deductive arguments to deduce conclusions. So similarly, when it comes to laying a foundation for knowledge, we start with some fundamental axiomatic points. Those are going to be points that we can't necessarily prove, but they're self-evident in the sense that you can tell that they're true just by understanding them. All right, and then once we have the fundamental axioms, we can use principles of deductive reasoning to deduce conclusions about what must be true. So in this model, the theory of knowledge can be described using a kind of metaphor. Just think about like a building, for instance, and the building has a foundation. The foundation supports the entire building. If the foundation goes, or if the foundation's no good, then the rest of the building collapses. We could view belief systems in a similar way, where you have some foundational beliefs and then maybe lots of other beliefs that rest on these foundational beliefs. So if the foundational beliefs are false and they support the rest of the belief system, well, then it looks like the entire belief system is going to cave in. It needs to go. It needs to be thrown out. All right. So in that sense, we have this really pressing need for some foundational beliefs that are self-evident and irrefutable. Right? So what exactly should we put in the foundation in order to have a justified belief system that might constitute knowledge? Descartes uses what is today called the method of doubt. So he thinks that anything that can be doubted cannot be put in the foundation for knowledge. If there's any possible basis for doubt, then we just can't use it in the foundation. So consider the possibility of using sensory beliefs as our foundation. We look out into the world and, we seem to see plants, flowers, squirrels. I seem to see a building. I seem to see a playground. These are sensory beliefs that I form on the basis of these experiences that I have when I look out into the world. Can I put sensory beliefs like that into the foundation for knowledge? So can I put the claim, there is a playground there, in the foundation? Notice that in order to have scientific knowledge, we would have to be able to make observations about the world and then put those observational statements in the foundation. So something like, when I look through the microscope, I see X, Y, or Z. And then we'd be able to formulate a statement, right? X, Y, or Z was seen in the microscope, and that could be in the foundation. All right, is this a kind of admissible piece of information to put in the foundation? Descartes has two arguments against the idea that sensory beliefs can be put in the foundation. His first argument is the dream argument. Descartes asks himself, might it be the case that I'm currently dreaming? Well, I don't really know for sure that I'm not dreaming. And if I can't know for sure that I'm not dreaming, then the claim that there is a playground there is not irrefutable. It's not self-evident. It might be false. All right, so that's the dream argument. Now, is the dream argument convincing? Well, you might think, I'm not dreaming right now. Why even consider the possibility? I know I'm awake. Right? Well, Descartes would ask, what method could you possibly use to tell that you are not dreaming? Is it going to be that you pinch yourself? Well, haven't you done something like that before in a dream, where you tried to pinch yourself to wake up and it didn't work? And so you thought that you were awake when really you were still dreaming? Or consider this possibility. What if your whole life up to this point has just been one long dream? Maybe, for instance, when you think that there's this difference between your waking life and your sleeping life, your dream states that you're in, that's just something that happens in this really long dream that you've been having for your whole life up to this point. And one day you're going to wake up from it. Is that something that you could refute? It's hard to see how you could, right? That seems to be something that's possible. Even if it doesn't seem all that likely or all that believable, it certainly seems possible, right? So it's not irrefutable. It's not self-evidently true. All right. Another argument that Descartes has against putting sensory beliefs into the foundation for knowledge is what's called the evil demon argument. So Descartes asks us to imagine a malicious, cunning demon who can fabricate experiences, can basically feed hallucinations into a mind and make that mind believe these things that it's being fed. So Descartes asks himself, can I rule out the possibility that there's an evil demon deceiving me, making it seem to me like there's a playground or that there's a squirrel, when in reality, there are no such things? These are just kinds of hallucinatory experience. Right? So the evil demon might make me think that there are lots of things in an environment around me, when the reality is that I'm just, a brain submerged in a vat somewhere. And the evil demon is just stimulating the brain and causing hallucinatory experiences. All right, is that a possibility? Well, of course it's possible. How could I know that that's not the way things are? I can't know that. It's not something that I could refute. It's not self-evident that I'm not being deceived by an evil demon. All right, so it looks like we have two arguments against the idea that knowledge through sensory experience is possible, that we can have certain knowledge through the senses. All right, what are some assumptions that Descartes is making here? So one assumption that we might want to think carefully about is an assumption called infallibilism. Descartes seems to be assuming that knowledge requires the impossibility of error. So if you know something, then it can't be the case that you're mistaken. Anything that you know, you have to be certain of, right? So if you know something, it can't possibly be true that you're mistaken about it. That's infallibilism. Maybe Descartes is making a mistake in assuming that knowledge requires this impossibility of error. In order to think clearly about infallibilism, it might help to think through an example here. So a useful example is what's sometimes called the lottery problem. The lottery problem says, imagine that you have a ticket in a lottery and there are, 10 million other tickets. And you have a number on your ticket and they're going to do a drawing. Can you know before the drawing happens that your ticket won't win, given that it's vastly improbable that your ticket will win? Seems false to say that you can know in advance of the drawing that your ticket is not a winner. So that suggests that even if you have, enough reason or evidence to warrant being like 99.999999% confident that your ticket's not going to win, that's not sufficient for knowledge. Well, what if there were 100 million tickets or 1 billion or 100 billion tickets? Would that be a high enough number to make it the case that you could know your ticket won't win before the ticket's drawn? And even with very large lotteries, it looks like you still can't know in advance of the drawing that your ticket won't win. So if that's right, that seems to suggest that knowledge does require the impossibility of error. If you know something, then it really is the case that you're justified in being certain to what you claim to know. So maybe Descartes' infallibilism assumption is totally justified. If it is justified, it's hard to see how we can know anything at all using our senses. Because if I say, I know there's a playground out there, notice that if there's a playground out there, then I'm not currently being deceived by an evil demon. Because if I were being deceived by an evil demon, there wouldn't really be a playground out there. This would just be a hallucination. Right? So since I can't know that I'm not being deceived by an evil demon, then I must not know that there's a playground out there. If knowledge requires this impossibility of error, it requires that I rule out this possibility of an evil demon deceiving me. So what's interesting about Descartes' first meditation is the implication of Descartes' theory of knowledge for what we can potentially know. It looks like we can't really know hardly anything at all based on our sense experiences. They might be mistaken. They might be misleading. In this way, Descartes is calling into question all of our knowledge that's based on sensory experience. Right? And notice, again, scientific knowledge requires that our senses are reliable guides to reality in order for us to have any scientific knowledge. Because if they're not reliable guides to reality, then we can't trust any observation that we make. We certainly can't trust observations that we make through telescopes or microscopes, so on and so forth. So the entirety of scientific knowledge would be thrown into doubt if Descartes' remarks in this first meditation are all true. The view that Descartes is defending in this first meditation is called external world skepticism, which is the view that we can't really have any knowledge at all about the world outside of our own minds. More precisely put, I can't have any knowledge of any external world outside of my own mind. I can't even know that you exist. Right? That's a very skeptical and, you might think, quite depressing scenario or possibility. All right, so are there any reasons to think that Descartes has made a mistake somewhere? And if so, what might the mistake be?